Sitting there at the kitchen table in the fading afternoon light, she found that the pain was still there as she reread the tattered, edge-worn note written in that familiar feminine handwriting. "Oh, Gerald, I know I shouldn't write this, but I really want you to know how good you make me feel. I'll send this to you at work, but you already know that if you've just got it. Silly me. That's your fault, isn't it? What did you say you'd do? Oh boy, I think you did that for sure. And you know it too, don't you? I hope you're looking forward to this Saturday as much as I am. We might even make it to the bed this time. Is reading this making you as horny as writing it is making me? Save it for Saturday. I wasn't lying when I told you I'd never seen so much before. Well, you save it all up for Saturday. I wish it would hurry up and get here. Just think. A whole day? What will we do to pass all that time? I'm sure we'll come up with something. Kisses and miss you. Janet." Valerie folded the letter and put it once more into a small compartment in her bag. She didn't know why she'd kept it. It was a painful reminder of an affair her husband had had some years ago. An affair that was long over. It had been a rocky time, but now their marriage was strong again. Still, she found herself reading the letter sometimes when she was alone. It no longer roused strong feelings in her, but she could never bring herself to throw it away. She got up and made coffee. It was after 5 p.m. Her husband would be home soon. Almost on cue, he turned the key and entered. He started talking immediately, a long outpouring. "Val, I should have called, but it happened so suddenly. Mr. Williams called me into the office to meet a chap from our U.S. parent company. Relax and tell me," as she said as she handed him his coffee. She bristled inwardly to hear him refer to his boss as Mr., but she let it pass. "Anyway, he's over here for 2 weeks, and they asked me to recommend a good hotel, and as I was telling them, Mr. Williams just said to me, 'Didn't you used to take in guests?' And I said, 'Yes, but not in some time,' and the damn Yank started saying he hated the formality of hotels and would be much more comfortable in a guest house, and well, before I knew what I was doing, I was inviting him to stay here." "What?" Valerie was stunned. "You can uninvite him. Let him go somewhere else. You know how Yanks are." He was impossible to put off, and before I knew it, he was getting in the car. Her husband explained. "You mean he's here? Now?" Valerie said, alarmed. "Yes," her husband bowed his head. "Waiting outside." "Well, you better invite him," and then as she said, angry, but resigned. James was aware of the burden this was placing on Gerald's wife. To have a stranger descend on you completely by surprise, uninvited, probably unwanted, really. He had suggested that he wait a minute in the car, while Gerald prepared his wife. "Not that she can have much choice with me standing out here with my luggage," he thought wryly. But he was accustomed to occasional discomfort as he traveled the world. It is such a pleasure to live in a home instead of a dumpy little hotel in some of these small towns. It was too inviting to resist, so sometimes he accepted. To be fair, he had seen Gerald's wife from afar at lunch earlier in the day. Gerald's boss, Gordon Williams, had pointed across his pint of bitter and his plate of plaice, peas and chips at the pub. She looked well put together and pretty, sitting there, knees tight together, on the stool by the low round table in the corner. He had to admit that was part of his reason for agreeing so eagerly to accept Gerald's rather forced invitation. She looked quite inviting, sitting there listening to her 3 friends' comments. He judged that she was rather quiet, letting others babble on while she thought things through before speaking. James thought also that her thoughts might be surprisingly intuitive, probably taking the conversation in surprising directions compared to outward appearances. The possibility of that was irresistible, as he so enjoyed women who had a mind of their own without being so boorishly intent on appearing assertive as was the popular tendency these days. He judged her to be in her mid-30s, like the softness a few extra ounces gave her figure, like the way her smile came quickly when it came, the way her teeth showed when she smiled. "Pretty, isn't she?" he said to his host. Yes, I suppose she is. Hadn't paid that much attention, I guess," the older man commented idly. James suspected he was lying in the way the Brit businessmen have about them. Still, Williams was a decent sort, and he was very hospitable and determined that James' stay should be as comfortable as possible. James found himself distracted from Williams's business talk by watching Valerie, as he found her name to be. She had crossed one knee over the other now and was leaning on it, her hand cupping her chin as she listened intently to the attractive blonde speaking animatedly across the table from her. He could just see the translucent, warm natural color of the nylon over her knee, the white spot caused where her crossed leg rested against the other one. Her chest, under her big fluffy sweater, seemed medium-sized, not overwhelming the rest of her. You were just aware of them, of their potential for discovered beauty. He could see from her profile the loveliness of their curve, so subtle and restrained as her bra supported their weight, helping, enhancing their natural opulence and grace. Yes, he said aloud to himself, I noticed Valerie. The cool evening air stimulated his thoughts. Oh, James, can you come through now? Gerald was calling from the door. It's all right. She is not going to bite. He laughed, then muttered to himself, either of us. He dropped his bag at the door and followed toward the large country-style kitchen where Valerie met him at the door, her smile perhaps slightly forced, but a smile anyway. She had an apron over the sweater and skirt she had worn today in the pub. I saw now that it had grayish flecks in it and was of soft, luxurious-looking lamb's wool that draped down the upper slopes of her chest. The neck cuddled her neck in a wide roll. The effect overall was of quiet quality. Her reddish-brown flannel skirt, buttoned down the side, hung just above her rather nice knees. Her tights are charcoal in this light, whereas I had thought much lighter from across the pub. Still, he hadn't been so far off, he thought pretty. Val, this is Mr. Carmody, her husband introduced him. He took her hand, warm and firm. Call me James, please, he smiled. Mr. makes me sound like a grandfather. Already he could see her softening toward him. He could feel a warmth toward her already, he thought. Come sit down, then. James, is it? As she had a natural warmth and genuineness that was appealing. It probably surprised her husband how this seemed to come through to strangers. How she was so much more quickly a friend with others than he was. James noticed that she had changed from low heels at noon to her flat shoes tonight, making a slight but perceptible difference in the look of her chest against the lamb's wool. Less prominent, no less promising than before, he smiled at using the words together rather cleverly. James was fond of entertaining himself in this way. He followed her slightly swaying hips under the flannel skirt, gazing at the hollows at the back of her knees as she led him to the dining room. The table was set with 2 candles, his place was at the side and she and Gerald sat on the ends. Her smile was easier now. James realized that he was being seductive. He really liked her. She was being seductive in her own way, too. Seductive in the way they were trying to draw each other into and through the joy of conversation. Not so much the way the word is usually used in trying to get someone into bed as quickly as possible. Though, looking at her through the candlelight, watching the candles dance in her eyes, he realized that he might mean that as well. Her cheeks were rosy now in the candle glow. Perhaps it was the hot oven she had taken the chafing dish from, or something else. Valerie was serving coffee now. The conversation over dinner had warmed to something close to a budding friendship. Gerald had become expansive and talked easily as if to an old school friend now. Now that they had shared a number of lubricating drinks. They were on brandy with the coffee now, and James found himself staring at Valerie so close to him as she stood close warming his coffee with a dollop of the brandy. He thought sardonically that it was not only the coffee she was warming. "Ah, fair maiden, you warm the cockles of my heart," he said, perhaps a little too theatrically. Valerie smiled back, so he knew it was all right. "I think you're warming more than sweetie." James." Gerald said it with a show of the camaraderie of men, winking broadly to James and swatting her lightly on her ample bottom, hugging her to him with the next wave of his arm. James was too cautious to fall in the trap of going completely on the side of all men are swine with Gerald, but he chuckled quietly to show that he did indeed appreciate Gerald's wife and that he appreciated Gerald's humor. It was a bit stronger than appreciation, he thought, but no need to let that out. She let him press her close, laughed as he nuzzled the side of her, not too obviously, but a bit too much in front of this stranger in their home. Valerie suggested going off to bed. "Morning will be here before we know it." "Yes, me for an early bed." James responded, "I'm all screwed up on the time since I got off the flight. I'll keep you up to all hours if you let me." "Too late for an early bed, James. It's after midnight and Gerald will be expected and on time, though you should have special consideration and not have to be there at the crack of dawn." She looked up into his eyes with a warm good-night sort of smile as he stood up, offering to take his cup to the kitchen. "Never mind, James. I'll take care of all that in the morning." James protested, but Gerald was on his feet, if a bit on the wobbly side. They both were, he and James. "Off we go, James. It's no good arguing with her. Has her own way of doing things, does my Val." He watched as Valerie stretched toward the ceiling with a show of weariness. Her chest were pulled up and cradled by the gesture, sort of centering themselves in a lovely curve like a large necklace or South Sea Island hammock around her lovely neck. He was having trouble keeping his eyes off her. He decided to make his way upstairs before he made some blundering mistake and spoiled it. Gerald had his arm slung low around her hips now as she stood next his chair, where Gerald had sat down again. "Yes, well, I'm afraid I will need to turn up pretty early, as well," he assured her, watching as she encouraged her husband toward his bed. They had put his luggage in the small bedroom next to their own, the other bedroom being under alteration. James unpacked, stripped off his tie and shirt, and examined his diary for tomorrow, thinking he would give them a little time to settle down with their preparation for bed. He found his shaving kit and strolled down the hall for the bathroom, toothbrush in hand. He always felt a bit awkward in an unfamiliar private home. He quickly realized that the bathroom was occupied, the door opened just by a few inches, the light shining through the opening. He started to retreat, then halted as his eyes adapted to the bright and the dark of the hallway. Through the opening, he could see the mirror on the wall, and in it, his reason for pausing rather than beating a hasty retreat to his room. Valerie was there, her image clear in the large mirror. She was leaning to remove her tights, or just finishing. His heart beat heavily as he gazed transfixed at the view down the front of her bra, her chest falling away as she bent from the waist. As she stood, she dropped the tights in a fluffy pile on the top surrounding the sink. She turned, giving him a sidelong view of her hip, smooth and round, the prominent curve of her mound and the dark curls proudly bristling out, softening the line of her body, emphasizing the curve, tantalizing his eyes. He snapped back from his reverie as she raised her arms over her head and dropped a clinging cream-colored full slip down over her head, settling on the high points of her chest and her hips, delightfully falling in place. Quickly, he stepped back to his room and slipped quietly inside. He could almost feel her scent as she strode past toward her room. When he heard the door close quietly, he stepped into the hall again and returned to the bathroom. It was getting on toward being a matter of urgency, given the quantity of liquids he had drunk without making a stop. He snapped the door closed, then realized that the lock was not easy to make secure. You had to lift it a bit to make it close properly. So that was why it had been open and gave him such a richly rewarding view of lovely Valerie and her opulent curves. He stood laughing quietly to himself, waiting for one or both problems to subside enough to permit his water to flow and at least relieve that part of his problem. He was still smiling to himself, leaning an elbow against the wall, when things cleared, loud enough to raise the devil passed through his mind, and he aimed for the side of the bowl away from the water. That's better, he muttered. Well, he thought, not sure can live this close to someone soft and attractive. He had begun to slur a bit, leaving out the shorter words in his drunkenness, but it felt good to be so loose. He brushed his teeth after a fashion. Staring at his image in the mirror, he imagined her image in the mirror alongside his image. Noticing how the overhead light was so bright that it made the scattered gray stand out among his dark hair. He was aware that it was not really that unattractive, though he was always surprised when he noticed it under such a light as this. Bloody prematurely gray, he muttered, grinning at his vanity. He took an aspirin and packed up his kit, turning off the light before opening the door to avoid waking his host and hostess. He slipped silently down the hall. He thought he heard something and stood still in the hall like a wild animal in the forest, his ears straining. The noise was coming from their room, not far away from his. James started into his room, then stopped again and listened. He could not resist it. I hope it's warm for me, he heard Gerald's voice. Not too loud, but delivered with a certain quiet, forceful fullness which made it carry clearly. SHHHH. James smiled at the husband and wife dialogue. He a little drunk, she wanting it too, but not as a public spectacle. She was quieting him. He imagined the man's hand on Valerie. You want this, do you? Got you a bit randy, didn't he? SHHHHHH, please. Here, let me. Then a masculine laugh carried through the house. Yes, he did. That Yank son of AB was charming your pants off, wasn't he? Well, wasn't he? His voice was teasing, urging her excitement higher. He heard their laughter now, muffled. Now that his eyes had become accustomed to the dark, he could see a little bit in spite of the dark, and he slipped closer. First the bed noises came to his ear, bodies rolling over. Kisses, slightly too noisy in their enthusiasm and his drunkenness. James moved just too close and touched the door, which gave way slightly, making a loud clicking sound in the night silence. He froze. Would he be caught? The noises resumed, though. He imagined the eager scene beyond the door. James smiled there in the dark. Oh, that's a dear. That's it, kiss them. Yes, more, but not so hard. Her soothing voice was musical to James standing so lonely there in the darkened hall. Want this? Sure you do. Bring that over here for me. Sure her hand would be on him now, James thought, guiding his clumsiness to her center, urging him to make the most of her excitement, to help her reach that glorious release. James came closer, still peering in at the little crack in the door. He could see a shape in the darkness. With a shock that took him aback, he realized that he was actually seeing Valerie. She was upright, James could see her hand disappear between their bodies and knew that he was right. It was excruciating to see this little bit of their you-know-what filling in the details in his mind. She had turned her face toward the door. Does she see me? James wondered, slightly alarmed. No. He reassured himself. It was too dark. Besides, she would not be one to be so brazen as to look at him while he watched her in this most intimate of moments. Still, it was discomforting enough to make him wish she would look away, so he was more comfortable backing away and slipping back into his own room. But she did not. Then he heard her sigh of release. A quick intake of breath. Oh, in a strange way it was almost a release for James. So much empathy had he developed so quickly with this pretty stranger with a ready smile. Then there was silence, followed by the sound of her moving to her side of the bed. James backed silently down the hall, slipped into his room. Slowly and quietly he got into bed, then coughed to cover the sound of swinging his legs up under the cover. It would be a long, lonely night after what he had listened to. Wow, he muttered in spite of himself. Valerie, Valerie, Valerie. He muttered silently to the ceiling there in the darkness. James was wakened by a knock on the door, rousing him from a brief troubled sleep, tossing and turning. Mr. Carmody. Good morning. 6:30. It was Valerie waking him for breakfast. Yes, thank you. He lay there thinking of his, what should he call it? Spying seemed too harsh. Yet what else could one call it? It still bothered him that she had been looking into his eyes in the dark. He remembered exactly what she had said, how she said it, loved the sound of her soft, intense sigh. It had been soft but firm, full of pleasure, soul, and meaning, almost enough to include him in its universal release. Will we be embarrassed looking into each other's eyes this morning? He wondered. He shook his head. Don't be ridiculous. She isn't even aware of how our paths have crossed. He could smell bacon frying as he came down the stairs. Good morning. He smiled at her across the large kitchen, picking up a cup from the table and crossing toward her, trying hard not to show any discomfort at her gaze. Good morning, she smiled. Her eyes held his perhaps a moment too long, examining him carefully. Perhaps she had been looking at him. He couldn't take his eyes away from her. The pleasure his host had, they both had had so noisily during the night, was burned into his mind and sprang back easily. Not sure, his lordship is not feeling too lord-like this morning, as she said, rolling her eyes skyward. James enjoyed her smile as well as her ready, somewhat sharp wit. Yes, I saw him in the hall. His last word was clipped as he remembered just what double meaning that might conjure in her mind. He thought lamely and unsuccessfully for a subject to take the conversation in another direction. She smiled in his direction, that warm toothy smile. Very apt, as she said, leaving it open to trouble his mind. Gerald arrived looking sad-eyed and tired. James says in America they would say you had been rode hard and put away wet. What do you think, dear? I said it was an apt expression. Which of us was she mocking? James wondered, having trouble keeping his thoughts together. I feel like something was done to me. He leered at James. You can't trust birds, can you? Get you drunk and think they can have their way with you. Do anything they bloody want. It's a crime, that's what it is. Well, he was awake and full of the devil, that was clear. James wondered again, who was being mocked here? Not sure that it was not him on both counts. He just couldn't be sure. He went to his room to pick up his coat, briefcase, and other things. James readied himself to go to the office in a very unsettled, tense frame of mind. On the other hand, he had thoroughly enjoyed his participation, or at least his intrusion on their life. Thoroughly. It had already sprung back into his mind several times. It was breathtaking, except for the uneasy sense that he may have been caught spying. Well, if I was, she seems to have enjoyed my spying, he decided at last. Returning downstairs, he found plans had changed. Hope you don't mind, James. I need to go a different direction this morning, so Valerie will take you to the office on her way to her jumble sale job. Oh, sure, no problem. He smiled as she bounced down the stairs pulling on her gloves. Ready? As she smiled up at James. James opened the car door for her and waited as she sat into the car and swung her legs into her car. He noticed that she rolled her eyes up to catch him staring at her legs as she swung her legs in. Did she open them just a little wider than necessary? Did she pause just an instant with one in the car and the other still on the ground? He wasn't sure. He closed the door firmly. She was still smiling. It occurred to him that he had to get over the tension of worrying about what she was thinking and go back to just taking things as they come. Still, it wasn't as easy as it usually was. Her thighs looked so invitingly creamy in her tights, her skirt fluffed up to about mid-thigh. James decided to relax and enjoy it, whatever the hell was going on. We're off, he intoned, tried to sound his usual bouncy self. Right you are. How did you sleep, Mr. Carmody? There it was again. His tension level soared. James, please, you make me feel old. Oh, sorry, James, as she gazed over at him, that angelic smile on her face. How did you sleep, James? He decided to give as good as he got. Well, fine. Once I got to sleep, that is. And you? A leading question, sir, as she bit her lip, suppressing her smile for the moment. Somehow, he thought that she had been probing for something and had gotten it out of him, or so she thought. James was so confused, he wasn't sure whether he had answered her or not. He stared as she spread her legs wider, touching the clutch and downshifting the little stick shift. They arrived and she turned toward him to wish him a good day with some little joke. Without meaning to do it, he touched her nylon thigh as he laughed at her joke. An electric charge literally leapt between them. Oh, I am sorry, he muttered. The static electric charge was an accident, but after exchanging a long glance, they both burst into laughter at the same time. He really hadn't meant to touch her thigh, had he? He wasn't sure anymore. He was confused. She turned more toward him, her knee elevated slightly and bent over to look up at him through the opposite side window, giving him a good look up her skirt along the taut nylon of her thigh. She roared away, leaving a bewildered American standing on the wrong side of the street, thoroughly confused and quite tense. Quite different from his usual cocky certainty. That evening, Gerald and James arrived home to find the aroma of dinner strong in the air. Well, this is a bit of all right, Gerald said, beginning a string of jokes about not getting anything to eat when the Americans went home again. Valerie didn't seem to see the humor of it. After dinner, they were invited to the local pub for a drink with friends. James tried to beg off, but they insisted that he was probably the guest of honor as far as their friends were concerned. It made a nice evening. Gerald spent a lot of time playing darts and chatting with his mates, leaving James alone with the two girls. James found himself concentrating on Valerie. They found a lot to talk about. Nothing terribly deep, just movies and books they had both seen, and then the funny coincidences of life and so forth. Midway through the evening, Valerie began touching his wrist when she wanted to emphasize a point, and James was doing the same. It was clear that they had established a bond. Come on, James, I'll give you a game of darts. There was a lot of laughter in their game and a lot of reason to touch each other as they reclaimed darts from the board. James became quite accustomed to the feel of his arm around her waist as she explained the rules and guiding her to her turn. Any excuse seemed to be a good one to touch her firm full curves. The touches were light, not meant to attract too much attention, but each one was warm and sealed their friendship a little bit more. Laughing at his jokes then pulling his arm against her. All in good fun. Back at home they were all ready for an early night. It had been a nice evening, each having had a good time in his own way. You're sure lucky, love, having two of us blokes taking you out, you know. Gerald had said in his joking banter. Gerald bought all the beer, you know, and I told all the jokes. We should both get a good night kiss, you know. Oh, stop, Gerald. She smiled. You two could turn a girl's head, though. But James was a good date while you were off with your mates all night, so why not? She tipped her head up and James bent for a quick thank you kiss. There's for being my white knight. Thank you, fair princess, he grinned. There she goes, James, give her an inch and she takes a yard. You be careful, mate. She'll have her way with you. Gerald stopped in the bathroom and Valerie patted him on the arm as she slipped past to her room on night. James, it was lovely talking with you tonight. Yeah, me too. James slipped into the little guest room. He bit his lip, tasting the little lipstick left there by her kiss. He liked the sweet taste of it, and he found himself rolling it round in his mouth. He waited until he heard Gerald go past, knocking and saying good night, James. See you in the morning. Then waited a while longer with the door ajar. Hearing Valerie sweep by, he opened the door and walked down through the cloud of a lovely feminine scent that brought a smile to his face. He found Valerie's tights piled in a puffy pile on the vanity and fondled them lightly, enjoying the way they made a colorful little mountain that seemed to be full of her warmth and her essence. Before turning off the light, he picked them up and touched them to his cheek. Lovely. He undressed, hanging up his clothes, turned out the night, and picked up the cloth to put them back in the bathroom. He was accustomed to sleeping nude and so he wore nothing, now that he was feeling comfortable in the house. In the hall he again heard noises from the adjoining room. He paused, listened, then moved close to their door again. Gerald sounded a little drunk but mostly just amorous. James realized by the sounds that someone was standing against the wall or against the door itself. Oh, dear, you are so good, There was scraping noise against the door, creaking from someone leaning heavily against it. James imagined Valerie there. James found himself listening at the other side of the door. Wonderful. Show. Oh heck, never mind. A move away from the door and it quieted down. Here, love, on the edge of the bed. Do you love it? Yes. James realized he had come in the excitement of listening to them on the other side of the door. An incident happened. Now what? What to do with the evidence? He hurried down the hall and dropped them back in the pile as he had found them. Just have to trust she won't find them until they have dried, he thought a little sheepishly. He made it back into his room just before the light lengthened down the hall and he heard Valerie pad down the hall to the bathroom. Oh, my God, he thought. He slipped into bed, pulling up the cover over his pounding heart. Valerie rinsed her mouth, brushed her teeth, and took an aspirin from the medicine cabinet. As she drank the water, she noticed in the mirror that she had forgotten and left her clothes. She started to rinse them out, first the tights, then a what? She felt the panties. They had a large spot on them, but examining them closely, she realized, could it be? She looked at her strange expression in the mirror. Suddenly it came to her. Had he been listening then? Yes, she heard herself answer. Her eyes were wide open in the mirror. In spite of herself, she sniffed it a little. No doubt what it is. With a quiet little smile, she slipped it up over her hips into place. She touched the spot he had left. When she had washed the tights, all the time with a smile on her face, she was slightly ashamed of her brazen act. She smiled impishly into the mirror and stared at the dark spot on the front of her cloth. She hung the tights to dry, turned out the light, and slipped down the hall. She dragged her nails lightly on his door, a final affectionate farewell. She slipped into bed beside her now relaxed and sleepy husband. Devilishly grinning, she moved up close behind him. Gerald squirmed a little, and she pressed even closer. She grinned in the dark. Serves him right, as she said to herself. Wednesday dawned in a quiet gray blanket. James awoke slowly, longing for a little more sleep. He hugged the pillow to him and closed his eyes against the light. His hand on the plump pillow reminded him of his hostess, the lovely, round, soft Valerie. Suddenly he was wide awake. The events of the previous night sprang into his consciousness. His mind came back to how it had made him feel separated from this just by the thickness of the door, driven to a huge wave of envy. He thought ruefully of whether he would be able to face her without letting her know all this, or would it be immediately obvious at breakfast? Guilt written over his face in huge red letters? Or would it just slip by unnoticed? One way to find out, he thought, springing bolt upright in bed, ready to face the world. Again this morning he could smell breakfast on the stove. As he shaved before the mirror, it came to him. Her tights were hung freshly washed in the bathroom, but the underwear were missing. He turned slowly, looking carefully around the bathroom, in the windowsill, not in the tub, on the floor, in the hamper. No, they were simply not there. What could be the explanation? He searched for a logical reason, hoping to avoid the obvious that he had been caught. But no, in the end it was the only conclusion. He thought about that rather embarrassing aspect of it. After thinking about it, he decided, forget it, you've certainly survived a hell of a lot worse problems than this, been in more embarrassing situations, done dumber things. What the hell? Let's go face the music. He bounded down the steps with enthusiasm and came into the kitchen as if he hadn't a care in the world. Valerie, the lovely Valerie, how are you this fine morning, my British beauty? Fine day again, eh? British sunshine, again, though, in a steady drizzle. Good morning, James. I'm fine, and how is my American cousin, then? Fit? Sleep as well, again did you? He thought. Does she suspect him of listening? Hard to tell. You'll have to forgive my leaving things in the bathroom. I keep forgetting. Hope they're not in your way, she smiled archly. It was the first time he realized what they meant in the books when they referred to us smiling archly. Well, he thought, I've surely been caught. Still, she seemed to be amused, perhaps even slightly titillated about him and his discomfort. Oh, not at all, Valerie. I can't pretend not to notice, can I? He smiled. So pretty and colorful. Kind of decorative, I thought. He stared boldly back at her. Valerie looked steadily into his eyes, her smile never wavering. She decided she liked this amusing yank. Enjoyed his blithe overconfidence. Charmed by his easygoing and open admiration of her. Pleased that he seemed to care about her and what she thought, in spite of knowing her only a few days. She had enjoyed it so much she had not yet changed, wanting to be wearing them with this memento of his passion for this moment of shared confrontation, and now she saw it was good. He couldn't know, of course, but she did. It made her feel powerful and loved and slightly naughty. Yes, colorful, that would be right. Yellow, weren't they? She laughed. Well, not to put too fine a point on it. No, they were red, actually. Oh, nice of you to notice, she laughed gaily. Now what will it be for breakfast? Eggs and ham? Nice fried tomato? I brought some of our fine Devon clotted cream and strawberry jam for your scones. How's that? Wonderful, perfect, all those things, thanks. Gerald joined them for just a cup of coffee, seemed to notice an air of tension, but didn't comment on it. They were soon off for the office, leaving Valerie staring out the window after them. She turned slowly and went up the stairs, down the hall into her bedroom. She stared at the soiled cloth, smiled and retraced her steps down the hall and into the little guest room. Curious, she lifted the top of his suitcase. What secrets does a man carry around with him, she wondered. A book, couple magazines, extra ties, nice colors, a box of protection. Valerie pondered the promise of the advertising on the box a moment, thinking what James might feel like in those. She sank upon the bed, lying in the hollow of the bed that had so recently held his body. He must have lain here thinking of me, as she suddenly thought. The penny dropped. She touched herself, the masculine, musky scent of him, the remainder of his aftershave lotion. Valerie buried her head in his scent. She did something with the cloth. She lay spent, and feeling luxurious there in his bed. She slept so peacefully for an hour or so before rousing herself, stretching like a large satisfied cat, and got on with her day. Happy. Later that night, James again made his way to the bathroom to brush and get ready for bed. He was disappointed this night. No beautiful curves in the mirror, no pile of undies left on the sink. Things are back to normal, he thought ruefully. He was soon in his bed staring up at the ceiling. He tried reading a while, but it was no good. His mind was preoccupied. Then, suddenly, he thought he heard sounds from the master bedroom yet again. He listened tensely. Yes, he was sure of it. He sat up to hear better, turned off the light so the light would not distract his hearing. He stepped across the room, unable to contain his curiosity. There was a different sound to the conversation. Valerie said "sh" less often he noticed. He heard her comments a little more clearly. Silence, and then masculine snoring. James listened. Nothing more, or perhaps she was just quiet. He lay back on his pillow and thought how it exhausted him listening to them. Sure, he felt slightly guilty to be spying, but not a lot. He thought of how it would be to lie with Valerie's head on his arm. He hugged the pillow into his face. Oh, what's this? His hand touched something under the pillow, something silky and unlike the sheets and pillowcases. Something soft. He turned on the light to examine what was in his hand. They were pretty lemon-colored, with a little see-through lace at the sides. His head reeled slightly. They were Valerie's, but not the ones last night. They were hers, left here by her for him. James realized his heart was pounding. Exciting, but having her intentionally leave them under his pillow was something else again. Something wild, he could hardly believe it. A treat, a joy, a pleasure, a delight, wonderful. He lay back and stared at the gift. There was a little stain. Dare he think it? Thinking of him? Yes, he answered. He thought of her here in his bed. James had taken them out to dinner tonight. It had been a happy meal, lots of wine and lots of laughter. Now that they knew each other so well, the conversation came easily. James had felt Valerie's foot touch his several times during dinner and returned her tentative touch with a firm and knowing pressure. They had slipped their shoes off, and as the wine took its toll, their toes became more active, fondling each other. He liked the feel of her toes. Gerald needed two guiding hands, getting to the car and then again as he rollicked along into his own home. He insisted on pouring them a nightcap and turned on some music. Valerie lighted 2 candles, casting the room into a warm glow. Gerald lay on the floor, talking with some difficulty on the sense of it all. James sat on one end of a small couch, Valerie at the other. James had trouble keeping his eyes off her, and she returned his glance with warmth. Gerald's breathing soon became very steady, then turned to light snoring. "I'd better get him upstairs, I guess." Valerie said. "Yes, I guess so." He couldn't think of anything else to say. "But we should finish our nightcap, don't you think?" James reached for his drink and placed his hand on the couch, reaching out toward her. As she did the same, their hands touched. The feeling was electric, and they both pulled back briefly and then relaxed. Their hands were barely touching, there on the seat of the couch, but the warmth exchanged was intense. They sat and stared at Gerald on the floor, sleeping soundly as the tension built between them. They sat like that for a time, and then James covered her hand with his, raising the level of tension still more. His hand over hers was the longest contact that they had had, yet she felt that they had an intimacy that was extraordinary. She turned to look into his eyes, which seemed to be fastened on her constantly. She enjoyed smiling at him, then seeing the warmth with which he returned it. She realized that they were kissing with their eyes. It brought a lump to her throat. Taking another casual look at Gerald on the floor, James leaned toward her in the gloom of the candlelight. She paused a moment, unsure, glanced at her sleeping husband, and then leaned to offer her lips. Their lips touched gently, then opened and pressed closer. She was shocked at the special shudder she felt. It was just like her first kiss when she was young. She felt that she was on a roller coaster that streaked down over her. The kiss lasted a long time. At last, James broke away and stared over at Gerald for a moment, then turned again. "Well, I guess we should get him up to bed," Valerie said at last, not really wanting to end it. Gerald was soon roused, rubbing his eyes and fumbling with the hi-fi. "Well, had to wake me up. Did you?" He was still sitting on the floor. "You want to help me with this little bunny, James, or do you have to get up early?" "Now, Gerald, off you go," his wife urged. His hands continued to fondle her as she preceded him up the stairs and down the hall. "Night, James," he slurred over his shoulder, bumping from one wall to the other, all down the hall. The door closed behind them, and he heard their talk continue. She was bawling him out for suggesting that James join them in bed. "Gerald, what are you thinking of? Saying such a thing in front of a guest, for heaven's sake. I've never been so embarrassed." "Thought you liked him, sweetie. Might be a bit of fun, you know. Come on, admit it, ha-ha. You'd love having it." "Eh? Gerald, for heaven's sake, not a chance." He heard her trying to shush him. "Oh, come on, love." Gerald did. "Oh, feels like you were ready." The sound stopped. It left James hanging, seemed incomplete. He thought he heard snoring. James went to his door, listened. It was snoring. Gerald, being a little worse for wear, had obviously fallen into a deep, drunken sleep. James felt rather than saw Valerie slip down the hall, then heard the light switch as she closed the door. He listened and heard water running. The light went off. James was certain he heard her stop briefly in the hall, listening at his door, then move to her room. He waited for the sound of the door latching, but it didn't come. As he opened his door, he could smell Valerie's perfume in the hall. He stood for a long time, tensely imagining the scene he had just heard take place. He wondered just how daring he should be. Gerald's snoring was loud and deep. Suddenly he was in the hall, listening. Like a deer in the woods, he stood stark still in the darkness, straining to hear, straining to sense Valerie there not 10 feet away. She had not closed the door completely. His decision was made. James slowly pressed the door. It creaked, sounding loud against the quiet of the night. He pressed again, another squeak. But Gerald continued his snoring. He could see nothing except the outline of the white sheets on the bed. Slowly he felt his way across the room. Standing beside the bed, he stopped to listen again. He felt that you could have cut the tension with a knife. His breathing, when he dared to take a breath, was labored and stuck in his chest. His pulse was pounding until he imagined it was keeping him from hearing. Valerie lay staring into the darkness, too. She heard the door open with a squeak. She knew that he was there. What was he doing, though? Surely he won't come in, she thought. Should I get up and go to him? No, I don't think so. Her mind raced excitedly. She could see his bulk now close beside her. Her heart was pounding with excitement. Half of her wanted him to touch her, half was scared, frightened that her husband would wake. She listened and realized that he was drunk and probably could sleep through an earthquake. But you never know. The danger was like a wall there in the room with them. James stood a long time beside her bed. Finally, she felt the presence lean over her. His lips touched her ear. She turned to meet his lips with hers. James felt the excitement of her touch shoot through his body. He felt disoriented, not sure if he was standing or on his head or his feet in the darkness. He felt her hand on his cheek, gently encouraging him. Just touching. He slipped his kiss down her chin, along her neck. Valerie felt the curly hair of his sideburns, and musing that he needed a haircut, she wanted him. She listened for any change in her husband's snoring. It was steady. She pulled James hard against her bosom. James's left hand slipped down. Valerie caught his hand and slipped it. She pressed it down. What had her husband said about them both, she thought to herself? Well, she liked it. He was right, though not quite the way he had phrased it. He knelt beside her, touching her lips with his again. Valerie took her cloth. Her touch was light as a feather. He paused a moment and continued his journey. Valerie felt James surround her. It was hot and exciting. She had never felt more completely fondled. James was being as aggressive as he could while trying not to move the bed for fear of waking Gerald. Valerie was engulfed in a luxurious bath of pleasure and feelings. The sensation was unimaginable. How long had she been engulfed in these sensations? How long could it go on? She felt the bed move with her tremors, but there was nothing she could do. Finally, it subsided. She lay completely happy and completely relaxed. Just wonderful, it was the only word. James silently covered her with the covers and then kissed her one last goodnight kiss and slipped silently out of her room, her cloth still tucked into his shorts.